October 16, 1989, the Kola Peninsula, deep within the Arctic Circle. It is a place of perpetual twilight, where the sun barely rises and the wind howls across the barren tundra like a living thing. Here, amidst the ice and rock, stood the pride of Soviet science, the Kola Superdeep Borehole, Site SG-3. For 2 decades, the USSR had been drilling a hole into the crust of the Earth, aiming to reach depths no human had ever touched. They told the world it was strictly for geology, to study the age of the planet, to understand tectonic plates, to find mineral deposits. It was supposed to be a triumph of socialist engineering. But on this freezing October night, there was no triumph. There was only panic. At 0200 hours, the facility's industrial klaxons began to scream. This was not a fire drill. The doors of the main drilling rig burst open, and dozens of Soviet scientists and engineers poured out into the snow. These were hardened men, veterans of the Siberian wilderness, yet they were fleeing their stations in a state of absolute, visceral terror. Some were weeping, others were catatonic. Inside the main control room, the shift commander, Dr. Dmitry Azakov, did not run. He sat frozen in front of the massive instrument panel, his hands trembling as he reached for a magnetic audio reel. The drilling bit had reached a depth of 12,262 meters. At that depth, the sensors had picked up a strange anomaly, and the team had lowered a heat-resistant microphone to listen to the movement of the lithosphere. Azakov pressed the playback button. He expected to hear the grinding of shifting rocks or the roar of subterranean gases. He didn't. Through the static, coming from 7 miles beneath the surface of the Earth, came a sound that defied all logic. It sounded like voices, thousands of them, screaming in unison. The official report would later state that the project was abandoned due to lack of funding and higher-than-expected temperatures. That was a lie. The drilling didn't stop because they ran out of money. It stopped because they were afraid of what was coming up the pipe to meet them. We are about to unseal the file on Project SG-3 and reveal why the Soviet military frantically sealed the deepest hole in history with a 12-ton metal cap. If you are brave enough to face what lies beneath, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. And before we begin, leave a comment below. Do you believe the legends that they drilled into hell, or did they find something biological down there? Let's find out. Welcome to the Red Dossier. To understand the horror of that night, you must first understand the sheer arrogance that built the machine. For most of the Cold War, the world's eyes were fixed on the stars. The Americans and the Soviets were locked in a desperate race to conquer space, to put boots on the moon and stations in orbit. But while the rockets went up, another race was quietly taking place in the shadows, a race downwards. The Kola Superdeep Borehole was the Soviet Union's attempt to journey to the center of the Earth. The goal was simple but insane. Drill 15 kilometers into the planet's crust to see what was truly down there. The location they chose was a frozen purgatory. The Kola Peninsula is a desolate stretch of rock and ice bordering Finland and Norway. In winter, the sun refuses to rise for weeks. The temperature drops so low that metal becomes brittle and engines refuse to start. It was the perfect place to hide a project of this magnitude. The facility built around the borehole, the SG-3, was not a simple oil rig. It was a massive, enclosed scientific fortress, a 20-story tower rising out of the tundra like a concrete tombstone. Inside, the Soviet Union gathered its brightest minds, geologists, physicists, and engineers who were the absolute elite of the communist state. They were rational men. They were strict materialists who believed only in data, rock samples, and the laws of physics. They did not believe in ancient superstitions. They did not believe in the supernatural. For 20 years they drilled. It was a brutal, grinding process. As they passed 7 kilometers, they entered territory where no human had ever looked before. At 12 kilometers, they were deeper than the deepest point of the ocean, the Mariana Trench. At these depths, the rules of nature began to change. The rock didn't behave like rock anymore. Under the crushing pressure of billions of tons of granite, the stone behaved almost like a plastic, like a living tissue. The temperature was supposed to be a manageable 100 degrees Celsius. Instead, it skyrocketed to 180 degrees. The machinery was melting. The drill bits were wearing out in hours. The earth was fighting back. But the orders from Moscow were absolute. Keep drilling. They wanted the prestige. They wanted to show the Americans that while the West owned the sky, the Soviet Union owned the ground beneath their feet. They didn't realize that by drilling that deep, they were not just breaking records, they were knocking on a door that was never meant to be opened. The trouble began weeks before the final shutdown, in the breathless dark of September 1989. The facility was operating on a 24-hour cycle, a relentless industrial hum against the silence of the Arctic. But down in the shaft, 12 kilometers below the boots of the workers, the sensors began to scream. The first signs were subtle. The geologists monitoring the seismic activity noticed a series of inexplicable vibrations. In a normal drilling operation, you expect resistance, the chaotic, jagged feedback of tungsten carbide crushing against billion-year-old granite. But these new readings were different. They were rhythmic. The pulses arrived at irregular intervals, but with a terrifying consistency in their strength. They did not look like the random tremors of shifting tectonic plates. To the tired eyes of the night shift operators, the needle on the seismograph looked less like it was measuring an earthquake and more like it was measuring a heartbeat. Then came the psychological toll. The Kola station was already a pressure cooker of isolation, but the mood shifted from professional fatigue to paranoid dread. Experienced drillers, men who had spent their lives on oil rigs in Siberia and the Caspian Sea, began to report debilitating headaches and nausea whenever they were near the borehole cap. Reports of auditory hallucinations began to pile up on the medical officer's desk. Workers claimed that during the brief moments when the heavy machinery was powered down for maintenance, they could hear a low-frequency hum rising from the pipe. It was a vibration that you felt in your teeth more than you heard with your ears. It was a sensation of being watched from below. Dr. Azakov forwarded these reports to the Ministry of Geology in Moscow. He requested a temporary halt to assess the structural integrity of the shaft and the mental health of his crew. The response from the capital was cold and immediate. The Americans are planning a new deep earth project. We cannot lose our lead. Continue drilling. They were pushing the drill bit into a zone of the earth that was never meant to be disturbed. The samples coming up were porous, filled with hydrogen and water where there should have been only dry, crushed stone. The physics were breaking down. The crew felt it. The machinery felt it. They were no longer drilling into rock. They were drilling into a warning, and they were choosing to ignore it. The moment that changed history happened at 12:45 p.m. The massive Uralmash 15,000 drilling rig, a beast of steel and hydraulic power, suddenly stopped shuddering. For years, the floor of the facility had vibrated constantly with the grinding of the drill bit against the ancient rock. But now, the vibration vanished. The gauges on the control panel went haywire. The resistance on the drill string dropped to zero. The engineers exchanged confused glances. According to the laws of geology, this was impossible. At a depth of 12 kilometers, the pressure is so immense, thousands of atmospheres, that rock flows like plastic. There can be no hollow spaces. A cavern cannot exist. It would be crushed instantly. And yet, the data was undeniable. The drill bit was no longer grinding against granite. It was spinning freely in a void. They had broken through the ceiling of a massive, inexplicable cavity deep within the Earth's crust. Driven by a mix of scientific curiosity and dread, Dr. Ozakov ordered the drill string to be retracted slightly. In its place, they lowered a specially designed probe, a heat-resistant microphone built to detect the shifting of lithospheric plates. They wanted to hear the sound of the planet moving. They turned up the gain on the speakers in the control room. At first, there was only the crackle of static and the low, menacing hum of extreme heat. Then, a sound cut through the interference. It wasn't the groaning of rocks. It was a high-pitched, agonizing shriek. The scientists froze. They adjusted the frequency, assuming it was mechanical feedback from the equipment. But as the filter cleared the noise, the single shriek multiplied. It became a cacophony. It sounded like a riot or a massacre, the distinct, terrified wailing of thousands of voices echoing against the walls of a burning cavern. It was a sound that triggered a primal, biological panic in every man in the room. They weren't listening to geology, they were listening to suffering. If you are fascinated by these dark chapters of Soviet history, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us dig deeper into the archives. For the men in that room, the scientific mission ended the second those voices came through the speakers. One of the junior technicians threw his headset to the floor and vomited. Dr. Ozakov stood pale as a ghost, his hand hovering over the emergency shutoff. They had drilled a hole looking for minerals, but they had found something that sounded terrifyingly like the religious definition of hell. And whatever was down there, they had just given it a way out. Dr. Ozakov did not call the press. He did not call his family. He did what any high-ranking Soviet official was trained to do when reality broke down. He used the encrypted line to contact the Ministry of Defense. The reaction from Moscow was terrifyingly efficient. There were no questions, no requests for clarification, and no surprise. It was as if they had been waiting for this call for years. The order given to Ozakov was just 3 words: contain, isolate, wait. Less than 2 hours later, the heavy thrum of rotor blades shattered the Arctic silence. Through the swirling snow, 2 Mi-8 transport helicopters descended on the facility like birds of prey. They bore no bright colors, only the dark green drab of the military and the fading red star of the crumbling empire. The men who jumped from the helicopters were not regular infantry. They were members of the KGB's elite Wimpel unit, a special forces group trained for sabotage and deep cover operations. But they were not dressed for combat against Americans. They were dressed for a biological nightmare. Clad in full-body rubber chemical warfare suits, the infamous Soviet OZK gear, and wearing gas masks that turned their faces into skull-like visages, they stormed the control room. There was no polite exchange of authority. The scientists were forcibly removed from their stations and corralled into the living quarters. The magnetic tapes containing the recording of the voices were confiscated immediately and placed into lead-lined briefcases. The commander of the Wimpel unit, a man whose name does not appear in the official personnel records, took control of the drilling rig. He did not look at the geological data. He did not care about the temperature readings. He positioned his men in a tight perimeter around the borehole opening, their automatic weapons raised and aimed directly at the dark, gaping mouth of the pipe. The scientific experiment was over. It was now a containment operation. The soldiers were not there to study what was down there. They were there to kill it if it tried to come up. And as they waited in the freezing cold, watching the sensors, they realized the drill string was still retracting. The probe was coming back to the surface, and it was bringing something with it.
The process of retracting a drill string from a depth of 12 kilometers is not quick. It is a slow, agonizing mechanical ordeal. For hours, the massive winches of the Uralmash rig screamed under the strain, pulling the steel cable up inch by inch from the abyss. The atmosphere in the drill hall was suffocating. The Vimple soldiers stood like statues, their fingers hovering over the triggers of their Kalashnikovs. The displaced scientists watched from the observation deck, their faces pressed against the reinforced glass, terrified yet unable to look away. They knew the physics involved. Bringing an object from that depth, from extreme pressure and heat to the freezing surface, was dangerous. The rapid depressurization alone could turn rock into dust, but they weren't worried about rock. As the depth counter on the wall ticked down, 5 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 1 kilometer, a foul smell began to permeate the facility. It wasn't the smell of oil or sulfur. It was a sweet, coppery stench, like old blood mixed with ozone. It made the air thick and hard to breathe. Then the winch stopped. The clamp engaged with a deafening metallic clang. Suspended above the borehole, steaming in the freezing Arctic air, hung the drill bit and the sensor probe. It was sizzling. The metal was still radiating the heat of the underworld, turning the falling snow into instant steam. But it was what was clinging to the metal that made the commander of the Special Forces step back. The drill bit was coated in a thick, viscous substance. It was pulsating. It looked like a glowing, phosphorescent sludge, a deep, iridescent violet color that did not belong in nature. It wasn't mud. It was biological. Under the harsh halogen floodlights of the rig, the substance seemed to be moving on its own, writhing against the cooling metal as if it were in pain. It was expanding, reacting to the oxygen-rich air of the surface for the first time in millions of years. One of the lead geologists, overcome by a fatal mix of awe and stupidity, broke protocol. He lunged forward from the group, perhaps wanting to scrape a sample into a jar. "It's alive! It's actually alive!" He got within 3 feet of the suspended drill. That was close enough. The substance didn't drip. It lashed out. A tendril of the glowing matter snapped through the air like a whip, striking the scientist's exposed hand. The scream that followed didn't sound human. It sounded exactly like the voices on the tape. The contamination had begun.
The infection did not take hours to spread. It took seconds. The moment the violet biological matter touched the scientist's skin, it didn't just burn him, it assimilated him. He collapsed to the metal grating, his body seizing in unnatural, bone-breaking convulsions. When he looked up, his eyes were gone, replaced by the same glowing, milky violet hue of the substance. He opened his mouth, and a cloud of spores erupted into the freezing air. Pandemonium broke out. The Vimple commander didn't hesitate. "Biological hazard! Open fire!" he roared through his gas mask. The confined space of the drill hall turned into a slaughterhouse. 3 soldiers opened fire on the infected scientist, their bullets tearing through his chest. But the man, or the thing he had become, didn't stop. Driven by a nervous system that was no longer human, he lunged at the nearest guard, tearing at his protective suit with manic strength. But the physical attack was the least of their worries. The substance on the drill bit was reacting violently to the surface pressure. It began to hiss, expanding rapidly into a thick purple fog that filled the room. The air filtration systems clogged instantly. Even through the heavy rubber of their masks, the men could hear the voices. The spores weren't just biological, they were psychoactive. Soldiers began to scream, firing blindly into the smoke, seeing enemies that weren't there. One trooper tore off his own mask, clawing at his throat as if trying to rip out something growing inside him. The discipline of the elite unit crumbled into primal madness. The commander, realizing the facility was lost, retreated to the blast door. He looked back one last time. The drill hall was a vision of hell, flashing muzzle bursts illuminating a swirling violet fog, while men fought shadows and each other. He slammed the heavy steel door shut and spun the locking wheel, sealing his own men inside with the entity. He grabbed the radio on his chest rig. His voice was calm, devoid of emotion. "This is Unit Leader. Containment failed. Initiate Protocol 221. Collapse the shaft. I repeat, collapse the shaft immediately."
Protocol 221 was not a rescue plan. It was an erasure. Moments after the commander's order, a series of dull, heavy thuds shook the foundations of the complex. Deep underground, pre-placed tactical charges detonated in sequence, collapsing the walls of the borehole. Thousands of tons of rock and concrete crashed down into the shaft, burying the drill, the infected soldiers, and the path to the underworld under miles of rubble. The screaming stopped instantly. The violet fog dissipated, freezing against the cold steel walls. Silence returned to the Arctic tundra. In the days that followed, the Soviet machinery of secrecy went into overdrive. The surviving scientists were debriefed, threatened with treason, and relocated to closed cities across the USSR. All physical records, geological samples, and the terrifying audio tapes were loaded onto an armored convoy and vanished into the archives of the KGB in Moscow. To the outside world, the Soviet government issued a boring, bureaucratic statement. The project was being suspended due to unexpectedly high temperatures and lack of funding. The collapse of the Soviet Union a year later provided the perfect cover. The world believed the Kola Superdeep Borehole was just another victim of a failing economy. But if you travel to the ruins of the facility today, near the town of Zapolyarny, you won't find just an abandoned building. Amidst the rotting concrete and twisted metal, you will find a heavy, rusted metal cap welded directly onto the pipe. It is bolted down with 12 massive screws, marked with the unassuming label SG3. It looks less like a scientific seal and more like the door to a prison cell. Tourists sometimes visit the site. They take photos, laughing about the legend of the well to hell. But the locals don't laugh. They say that on the quietest nights of the polar winter, if you put your ear against the cold, rusted metal of that cap, you can still hear something faintly vibrating through the iron. It's not the wind. It's a rhythmic scratching from below. We may have sealed the hole, but we didn't kill what we found. We just trapped it, and it has been waiting in the dark for 40 years. What do you think really happened at Site SG3? Did they find a new form of life or something far more ancient? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you want us to open more files from the Red Dossier, make sure you are subscribed. Until next time, keep your eyes open. The truth is deeper than you think.